Well, maybe one of my problems is that I'm not committed, right? So I talk about my love for the Christian tradition, for Jesus. I feel his presence when I pray. And yet I don't seem to belong to the institution in a way that people would think you should. You know, people think that if you're a Christian, you should join the club, be a paid-up member and do what's good. And then I don't do that. I'm talking about it. Now, I'm talking about it to you, and that to me is a kind of a sense of community. So I'm sharing with you my faith. It's not that I'm talking about it intellectually. If I go on a radio or a television program and they ask me, how did I get through depression? I will tell them, and I will sometimes use ideas that come from psychotherapy. But it's not that I'm a psychotherapist. I'm simply trying to use language to explain how I feel. And I think that that's just the only thing any of us can do to make community, to make love, to make a connectivity between us and our families, is to actually share, actually use whatever language you can to share how you feel. I think that would be number one for me. And number two would be, I suppose, to try and make everything you say resonate out of a space of calmness or calm abiding. So that if I'm speaking out of a disturbing emotion, let's say I'm angry, and then I'm talking out of that anger. I'm translating my anger into some sort of language. That to me doesn't seem right. So the very fact of trying to communicate has built into it an idea of trying to be calm as well, because when you're communicating in a disturbed emotion, like with anger or jealousy or whatever, you're not actually communicating yourself. It's only when you get to the core of who you are as a calm person, that's where you are, truly. And out of that comes your language. So the idea, you see, of talking, speaking, is always hinged to the idea of silence. Our words come out of silence. Our words come out of a pool or a well of calmness and calm abiding. Now, when I go to talk, when I want to do a podcast, sometimes I have to make sure that I come to a calm place. And that makes me face up to things I might be uneasy about. And one of them is what I'm saying to you, that I sometimes am uneasy that I don't belong to an institution formally. I'm not a paid-up member of any parish. Now, I'm unequivocal about where my root is. I mean, my root is the Roman Catholic Church, into which I was baptized, into which I was ordained. That's my space. But I don't go and knock on the door as a paid-up member very often. I do go to the church. I do go to churches up and down the country. I slip into the back of some beautiful church in Kerry or Donegal or Waterford, and it's gorgeous. And I feel so grateful that there are these huge big temples. Like if you saw them in an Asian country, if there were Buddhist temples in an Asian country, you'd be saying, isn't it wonderful that they have this huge amount of architecture to help them pray? But we actually have this in Ireland anyway. I don't know how long we'll have it going forward, but for the moment, there are these places where you can go in any town, and the door is open, and the sanctuary lamp is lit, and you can be still there before the altar and say your prayers, and that's a huge advantage. Now, I sometimes I get so amazed and enthused about the Orthodox tradition that I think maybe I ought to, join the Orthodox Church. And again, I would have friends, Orthodox friends, who'd be encouraging me, who'd be saying, maybe it's time that you joined us. But they would be seeing that then as very exclusive, And this is where my problem arises, because there used to be an old adage when I was studying in theology, extra ecclesiam nulla salus est. And it was the idea that outside the church there was no salvation. Now you'd wonder, why did people come to that conclusion? And I suppose you'd have to look at history and all the divisions there were between different churches in Europe due to the Reformation, and then you'd conclude that, okay, it became the modus vivendi of each organization to say, well, if we're the true church, then you can't get salvation without us. It's like you had to make yourself exclusive because you were trying to distinguish yourself from the other crowd who you thought were wrong in their theology. But that created, I think, this problem about the whole sense of an institution, that you belong to the institution in a very radical way. You must be a paid-up member. And if you're outside it, you get no salvation. And that also kind of brought in this unfortunate idea of, I suppose the word salvation doesn't mean much to people nowadays, But there was this sense that you saved your soul, and that it wasn't you who did it, but it was Christ who did it. And it was done through the sacrifice of Christ on the cross, that he had saved us all. It's very hard to break that down into the real meaning that's underneath it. I think that the real meaning underneath it is beautifully contained in a book by a fellow called Bentley Hart. Bentley Hart is an Orthodox theologian, and he recently wrote a book with the title, That All May Be Saved. And his argument, which is a kind of a mainstream argument in Orthodox teaching, is that eventually, in the fullness of time, God's love and grace is so infinite that everything will be redeemed. Everything. Every blade of grass, every ant, every little minuscule fly, and every sentient being, and every human being, of course. All will be brought into the complete light of God's love and presence. And it's so hopeful to think about the universe like that, that we're moving forward all the time in a positive way, evolving in a positive way, and that we may have terribly dark times, but ultimately we are all going to reach this final destination of glory, of joy, of peace. And it may require the shedding of our egos, ourselves, in a way that's very painful, letting go of the self. We may not even do it in this lifetime. There may be a journey further on beyond the veil of death. Who knows? But it's not a bad story. It's not a story of punishment. It's a story of the immeasurable love of the Godhead for us. As I say that, it calms me down. I feel better already. And that sense of that all will be saved, it's the opposite of the idea that outside the church there is no salvation. So you'd be fair to ask the question, like, how are the two things there as contradictory? And it's not for me. I'm not bright enough to explain or even to understand what's the difference between the two? One is like exclusive, like, oh, outside here there is no salvation. Is really only to emphasize that being here is terribly valuable. So if I step into a church where there's a liturgy going on, I'm stepping into liturgical time. I'm going through a portal into eternity. I'm in eternity. I am in heaven. At the surface level, as humans, we're enacting this ritual, but ultimately, this is about being in heaven. My consciousness may be trapped in the disturbing emotions of my mind at this moment and my physical body, but at the core of me, I am now, if I'm in a liturgical moment, I have entered into endless time, because in the liturgical moment, eternity, in the sense of the dynamic between God's love and all creation, is just continually happening, eternally happening. So on the one hand, you have this sense that, a church says, well, we're exclusive, outside us there's nothing, and they're only trying to say how completely, absolutely special they are. And in that sense, each one of them is right. If the Roman Catholic Church says we are exclusively the church, outside this you have no salvation, I think that's true. And if the Orthodox Church says the same thing, I think that's true too. Because from each one's point of view, from each one's perspective, of course they are the only church. Of course that's the only pathway to salvation. In the same way, I suppose, as I'd often say, that whatever I am doing in this present moment is the only thing I could do. I don't have any choice, really. And if I surrender to that and recognize that, I become very free. I become liberated. I become enlightened in the moment, because I know that I have no choice. And so here is the key to my feelings of unease about whether I should belong to an institution or not. The key is that I have no choice. Right? So I could waste my time agonizing about whether I should be more involved in my church, or whether I should go to the Orthodox monastery and stretch myself on the floor and say, I wish to proclaim my belonging in orthodoxy. Or maybe I should go to some Buddhist center and take more vows of dedication to another teacher. These are the ways that I agonize about, how I am behaving as a religious person. How I am falling short of the mark in what I'm doing. And it's resolved. It's resolved when I say to myself, I have no choice. That in some sense, the world I'm living in, the world I'm given, is the world I need to respond to. I need to ask, I was saying this in the previous podcast, what is God asking of me in this moment? This is the moment, this is the only moment of my salvation. This is the only moment of my liberation. This is the only moment of my joy. There's no other chance but this one now. You say to yourself, well, how are you going to make up with an enemy? How are you going to make up with somebody in the family that you have a dysfunctional relationship with? There is no answer to it in the future. There's only now. There's only this immediate moment. And in this moment, if that's the question you're being asked, why do you feel alienated from your child or your parent or whatever? The only space is now. And in the same way, speculating from my point of view about, well, whether I should be more involved organisationally in the church or in some other church or some other religion, they're only speculative questions that have nothing to do with the reality that where I am in this moment is where God has placed me. I had COVID last week. God gave me COVID. That can be misunderstood by modern people who are outside the religious tradition because they think, well, that's an appalling, twisted thing to say. You're telling me that you think that God is going around giving people COVID. That would be nasty. But they're only reading it in two dimensions. Being here is where we are anyway. Struggling with ill health is what we do anyway. Struggling with evil is what we do anyway. Bringing God into the mix is bringing in a dimension that allows us to understand the suffering and understand the evil. Because we're saying, well, the COVID is a bad thing. It's a disease. It attacks the body. It kills people. So it's not good. But at the same time, I now have it. But this is the situation within which God is inviting me to be enlightened. And in my little experience of COVID for a week, it was like having patience. Just patience to deal with it. Just patience to accept it, because it disturbs your emotions. I always find that physical illness disturbs my emotions. That's always what gets me. I always feel awful when my emotions are disturbed like that. But if I'm saying that God is here now, no matter what the situation, and it's like thinking about the suffering as actually the pain of God. And again, somebody outside religious tradition will think, well, that's perverse because you're saying that, God likes to suffer or something, that God is a sadist. He sent his son to be tortured on a crucifix, on a cross. But you're not saying that. You're saying that we have the cross anyway. I mean, we had it in the time of the Romans, in the time of Jesus. It was like just a common thing that happened every day of the week. People would get crucified by the Romans for, doing wrong. Robbing an apple or whatever they did wrong, I don't know. But they got crucified. So we have the darkness anyway. Bringing God into the equation is not suggesting that God is a perversion, but it's like God is a dimension of light that allows us to cope with the evil or the illness. And the illness is there like a darkness, and the illness is there, and it won't go away. I mean, if I'm ill, the doctor says, well, you have this, that, or that wrong with you, and we're going to have to do all these tests, and we're going to have to send you for a sort of a procedure or this or that or the other. There's no way out of it, You're not getting a choice about it. You're being told that's the situation. And God is the dimension of comfort and consolation that you bring into that space. And the first step is to acknowledge that there's no choice. You don't have a choice. This is where God has left you and is with you. God is with you in your darkest hour. God is in you in a way that sometimes the darkest hour, the great suffering that comes to any of us in illness or in mental afflictions and depression, whatever, that it tears us apart, but it tears us apart at the surface level of our self-identity, And through that painful journey, sometimes we experience a depth of presence within us that we recognize to be God, and it gives us comfort. In that sense, God never leaves us alone. I'm 70 years of age, and you start thinking about the shortness of life because, well, at 70 you have most of your life behind you. And is religion comforting? Yes, it is. And I don't have any bother with that. I enjoy the fact that it is. I get consolation from it, and I know I get consolation from it. To feel that even in the darkness of death, in the annihilation of the grave, there is a sense where I am surrendering my deepest self into the arms of Jesus. I don't know how that is true. I don't know at what level it's true. I think you'd need to be a scientist and a philosopher to talk about truth and mythological truth. But I do know it's true, or I should say I believe it's true. And that again is what draws me back to feeling, should I be more involved in a church? Should I be more involved in a different church? Those questions come because my heart is animated and enlightened by the wonderful possibility that God is present with me. I'm sitting in this room, there's nobody here. I'm a bit winded and tired from COVID. I'm a bit winded and tired from now 6 days of antibiotics. Right? But even in this moment, and I'm too tired even to cut the grass, these are all human moments. We all experience these ordinary little moments. I'm too tired to cut the grass. And yet in these moments, if you begin to say, I have no choice about this moment. This is how I feel. My whole destiny was to meet this moment. And if I meet this moment with a sense of God's presence in me, it gives me consolation and it gives me hope. It just changes the dimension. It changes from despair to hope. I find sometimes I get into despair when I'm in a tunnel of my own making, when I'm feeling physically tired, physically exhausted, emotionally tired, emotionally alienated from other people, whatever. And all that can build into a tunnel, and it's like there's nobody in the universe but me, and I'm suffering. Now, when I turn that into the idea that the universe, the cosmos is full of the Godhead, the cosmos is breathing love in every molecule, and I am in that, I belong in that, I don't have a choice about it, I was called to be here in this moment, then my sense of tiredness or suffering or alienation are all contextualized by the underlying sense. Not that there is a God, like as a kind of categorical object in the universe, but that actually the universe is the manifestation of God. It's like the universe is a rose. It evolves like the flower of a rose. Complex and beautiful beyond all imagination. It just evolves. And I am part of it, and you are part of it. We're not different from it. We're not like... I know that we have this consciousness that we can objectify otherness. And we can look at the kind of clock on the wall and say, that's a clock. Or you can look at the person in the bed and say, that's the lady wife or the husband. You can objectify the world, but ultimately, there's a kind of an integrated, cohesive fabric with every element, every electron and neutron and proton in the entire cosmos. And we just are part of it. There's an interdependence that's totally different from, like, if you think about our bodies and you think your body is your own, it's inviolable, it's different from other people's bodies, that's okay, but that's the way you perceive it even visually. And if somebody came from Mars or further away and they came in a spacecraft and they landed here and they looked around and they didn't have our perception, right? Because we only select, in evolutionary terms, we have selected what we can see. And there's loads of wavelengths that we don't acknowledge in our seeing, whereby we can then construct this beautiful Earth. But somebody coming from a far-off planet might land and find that the whole Earth seems to be like a soup. And there are things moving around in the soup, like you and me, and this person from outer space wouldn't be able to distinguish the two things as utterly separate. They would think that they were kind of dynamically connected, because there's so much at the surface of your skin that's connected with the air, and the air is connected with more air, and there's stuff coming out of you, interacting chemically with the world around you all the time. You walk down the road and you get the smell of fresh bread from the bakery. There's molecules involved in that. There's something coming off the bread, in the air, going up your nose, being absorbed by you in your smell. Quite extraordinary. Even at a physical level, how interdependent we are. And that's not to mention this sense that the whole musical score, the whole scale of my musical emotional expression is simply constituted by my parents. I talk like my father. I emote like my father or like my mother. You'll see people sometimes and they'll have a quirky way of being emotional, or an emotional personality, if you like. They might be very comic and funny, or they might be very dour, or they might be very melancholic. And you hear somebody saying, well, his mother was like that. You hear somebody saying, he's the spit of his mother. Same person. So there's very little originality in us, And whatever we add new to that through the educational process, which makes us different from our mothers and fathers, we are socialized into a way. We just acquire the behaviors, patterns, language, tones and emotions of the culture we live in. A great way to see that sometimes is when you see Germans, let's say, and they came to Leitrim in the 1970s and 80s, a couple of generations ago, and then after about 2 generations you find the grandchild and they're walking around Drumshambo or Carrick-on-Shannon, and they're just walking like a Leitrim young lad, and they're talking like a Leitrim young lad, and their emotions are like Leitrim young lads. And you'd say, where did the German go? Well, they have a little bit, obviously a little bit of breathing, which is coming from the parents. But then there's a huge amount of socialization, which is just social. And even diseases that we get. God forbid, but you know yourself that there's a propensity sometimes in certain families for certain diseases, in certain cultures for certain diseases. Something, as they say, runs in the family. So between the kind of collective of the social life you live and the way that you're brought up, and the genes that are coming from your parents and your grandparents, there's not a lot left for you, like a blank slate that you kind of going to invent your personality on. You are already a construct. And I suppose that shows how important education is and how bringing up children is, because they too will be the result. They will be constructs of the way we live. And if our society lives in a kind of a very reckless way, a way, let's say, where we neglect children, well, then we're building, we're constructing troubled people. I used to always be amazed, when I went way back in the 80s and I went to live in Fermanagh. And I had grown up in Cavan. It was only 30 miles away. And yet the attitudes of young people in Fermanagh were so different from what they were in Cavan. Because they grew up in the north, in Fermanagh, within the context of a political situation that was divided. And they just absorbed it. They just, as they'd say, they licked it off the ground, the sectarian attitude to the other side. And it wasn't everybody, obviously, but it was sad to see it when you'd see it, on both sides of the divide, among young people. So the children turn out really the way we socialize them. And that's a good news story to a great extent. Personally, I think that the entire Western cultural project for the past 200 or 300 years is ultimately a really good story. And there's a lovely philosopher called Steven Pinker. Steven Pinker, if you really want heavy philosophy, but really good stuff, he's a great guy and very optimistic about how well we're doing. You wouldn't believe it that, when you turn on the news and you look at the terrible trouble in the Middle East and you look at Darfur and you look at the Ukraine and all over the world, terrible things, and you think, God almighty, we're in a terrible state. But there's other ways to look at it which are much more positive. And if you want somebody to read like that, Pinker is the man, Pinker. But all I'm saying is that this world is given to me. And the more I feel alienated from it, the more I'm huffy with it, the more I'm uneasy with it, the more I'm complaining because I'm antibiotics and I'm feeling, miserable and despondent because of these chemicals that are going into my body. The more I do that, the further away I get from God. But the more I accept that, like, this situation I'm in now this afternoon, this is the only place I should be. The people I'm with at the moment are the only people I should be with. Because within all the process of suffering and socialization, if I take in the dimension of God, then God has willed this. Even in the suffering of it. Not that he's trying to impose darkness or evil on me, but he is carrying me through the darkness, which happens to be there anyway, and it's going to be there one way or another. God is not responsible for evil. God is what carries us through the evil moment. So, if I should be more involved in the church, then I will find the invitation will come to me. If I should be more involved in a different church, then the invitation will come to me. I will see a sign, I will get a signal, I will see some pattern in the world inviting me to change my life. Otherwise, I am where I should be. And I have to say that I've used that in relation to my work as a writer. All my life, for 40 years being a writer, I don't know what's going to happen next for me as a writer. I haven't tried to shape, like I would have loved to write more novels. I wrote 3 novels. And then 2011, I would have loved to write a bit more and got better at it. And I got an invitation to write a memoir. It came in the form of an email from the publisher saying, we're reading you in the Irish Times, you do write good columns, stories. Would you like to write a memoir for us? And I responded to it. I said yes. And then they wanted another memoir and another memoir. And after about 3 memoirs, 3 books, I'd say to them, I'd like to write a novel now. And they'd look at me like, well, we don't want you to write a novel now. This is not an invitation to write a novel. This is an invitation to continue what you're doing, which is lovely and beautiful and very interesting. So all the time in my life, I feel I've been responding. When I haven't responded, when I've tried to drive my own pathway, I have felt far away from God. When I have surrendered to the inevitability of what happens, no matter what it is, a rainy day, an illness, whatever, if I can just get in there and accept that this in some mysterious way is God's will for me. And again, not that he's delivering unto me the darkness, but that if I face this moment of darkness or tribulation with a sense that there is a huge, bigger story of presence, divine presence in the universe, which is in me, where I belong, and is loving me with every molecule of my body through this illness, through this time of difficulty, then I'm close to God. I feel relief. It's a strange thing. And recently, my life took another turn when they came to me, 2 young lads came to me before Christmas and said, would I be interested in taking part in a little short film? And again, I'm not out there looking for parts in movies, but I said, yeah, I'd love to do it. And we filmed a little it's about 15-minute long film. And we filmed it. It was filmed in January, and it'll go on some sort of release in the summer of 2024. Maybe, I don't know, maybe at the Galway Film Fleadh, I don't know. Maybe somewhere else, who knows. But again, it's like things happen in your life. And sometimes nothing happens, Sometimes nothing happens. But that's where you need to be. Being still or being active is always a response. You're being invited to be here now. And when you run away from it and when you try and think, well, I could reshape the world, I could make the world different, I could make my life different. When you think that, you get further away from God. But when you accept just being who you are, where you are, you will feel close to God. Now here's the final thing, I just want to share this. When you do the acceptance stuff, when you do the let go and let God stuff, when you say, I'm not going to figure out now which religion I should be involved in, I'm not going to figure it out, I'm not going to sort of shape and carve my life in this regard, I will just be where I am now. I will be here now. And I will pay attention to the present moment. And when you do that, it's amazing how the invitations flow in at you. Does that make sense? What I'm saying is that sometimes You want to change your life of your own accord, and you have a clenched fist and you say, I want to change my life, I'm going to change my life. You just end up going further away from God. But if you say, no, I'm not going to try and change my life, I'm going to be here, I'm going to be in this relationship, I'm going to be where I am and do my best in this moment. When you surrender like that, it's amazing how the invitations suddenly start flowing. God's energy is allowed work because you're not blocking it. And it's very often the sure way to changing your life. God will change it for you. God will change it for you. He's like, I'm not driving the train. Pay attention, and then God will change your life. And you'll know the difference. That sense that you're doing something radical because you feel God has asked you to do it. Because you've seen some sign, you've felt some signal at the core of your being that's like not coming from you, but it's like just, you're seeing it. You're seeing the signpost that says, go now, change your life. And you're doing it because you're like responding to the fact that you've been listening and you feel that you've heard something. There's a dynamic of listening. That's what prayer is. It's the dynamic of listening. I don't know, will I ever become more formally engaged with the Roman Catholic Church, or will I someday, proclaim and confess allegiance to the Orthodox Church? I don't know, but I can only go where I'm led. I can only follow where I am called. And to hear the call or to see where I'm led, the only thing I need to do is pay attention to the present moment. And then in this moment, I hear. I hear a call. And I felt that, I have to say, when I was ordained a priest. I went and tried it to be a priest when I was 19, and it didn't work out. And all through my 20s, for about 2 or 3 years, 4 years, I just knew I was being called. And then I responded. And I felt it was an absurd thing to do, and it was an absurd thing to do. So my life has been absurd. I mean, it makes no sense. Crazy. And it makes no sense that I ended up as a writer. Crazy. But every time I tried to sort of listen and feel, I'm here in this situation, I'm not changing anything, but I want to listen, I want to hear what whispering voice of God is saying. Be still, be here, or move, go, be changed, do something different. If you listen for this presence of God, then you have reached, I think, the pinnacle of prayer. And there is nothing else to be done. Nothing. You're just, there's nice ways to say it, like you'd often hear people saying, spend time with Jesus. You'd see monks there very often and sisters, and they'd use the Blessed Sacrament as a kind of a devotional focus, and they'd have a little oratory. I always remember going to a convent one time in the Midlands, I forget where it was, and there was Italian sisters in it, and I was chatting, some sister had brought me in for tea, and she's talking about the convent they had, and she said, would you like to see the oratory? And I said, yeah, and we went to look at the oratory. It was a lovely little oratory with about 3 or 4, 6 pews on either side, and there was one nun. She was an Italian woman. She was one nun. She was there in front of the Blessed Sacrament, and we disturbed her for a few seconds, and then we withdrew. And her presence stayed with me. That was about 1980. 44 years later, I can still remember that moment. I can still remember her name. Imagine she affected me that much. Imagine she affected me because she was paying attention to God's presence. She was abiding in God's presence. She was like, Mary and Martha are there, and it's like one of them is sitting at his feet and she's just being present with him, and the other one is busy, and the busy one says, listen, that one's sitting in front of you, she should be helping me clean the dishes. There's things to be done here. And your man, Jesus, he says, this one here, she is the best part because she's with me. Such a human, beautiful story, but underneath it is this wonderful idea that God is present. And all we have to do is pay attention. All we have to do is pay attention. In every situation, let go of the self-obsessing anxieties and pay attention. And then it'll all work out. Even if there is more darkness, it will be like a storm, but you will feel the presence of transcendent Godhead is in the boat with you. And that's what will make the difference. As you grow old or sick or weary or lonely or alienated, that God is with you, present with you. At the very core of your own being. Meister Eckhart is an amazing description somewhere about a saucer, And the edge of the saucer is where the saucer is like your psyche. The edge of it is where things from outside penetrate you. And then there's layers inside where things penetrate at a deeper level. But then there's a center of the saucer where nothing penetrates. Nothing from outside comes in. And that center is the center of your psyche, your soul. It's untouched by anything except God. The very core of you. So that your sense of self and ego just dissolves like air into the entire cosmos. And you realize that the core of you is the core of the universe, is the core of every space in the universe, is the core of every being in the universe. There's just the one core. All you have to do is pay attention, listen, and stop driving the train yourself. And then you'll have no worries. Listen, my dear friends, I've enjoyed sharing this. I've enjoyed sharing this so much, and I'm totally daft. But thank you for being here.